names like Tom and Matt were associated with intelligence and generosity, empathy, and so on and so forth. So the content that's on the internet that's training these models is biased because we are biased as human beings, and we're putting this stuff on the internet. So we've got to be very, very careful about making any inference from these AI models without strict balances put in place to check for these biases.
I'm sure you're familiar. You may be familiar with the debate that's raging in Ireland right now over hate speech laws that are coming in. And I wanted to get your perspective on this as an expert and authority on hate. The legislation is in our parliament to basically create hate speech laws and there's protected classes, so protected characteristics they're called. So gender is one, sex, race, etc., etc., etc. There's a lot of pushback right now happening over here because people are concerned that there's no definition of hate, right, in the legislation. So hate can mean any damn thing the government decides it means, but it may impact freedom of speech and the freedom to criticize. So say, for example, and I suppose one of at the forefront of the conversation is the trans debate.
Yes.
Right. What's your perspective, on hate speech laws?
Yeah.
And then as they relate to freedom of speech and how we actually keep having these conversations that people feel are important.
The same is going on in Scotland right now. Scotland has just introduced similar legislation. Interestingly, just for context, we've had legislation on this in England and Wales for a long time. They're called the stirring up offences in one category. So it prevents the stirring up of hatred against certain categories like race, religion, sexual orientation. So to stir up hatred, you have to repeatedly try to convince another person to hate. So the bar there is very high. It's not a one-off statement on social media that would reach that threshold. It has to be very high. The other provisions that we have are in the Communications Acts in England and Wales, which also cover Scotland, actually, where it's illegal to cause gross offence to another person, which is way more than just offence. Causing offence is perfectly legitimate, where we should be able to offend each other. That's part of freedom of expression, and it's protected in the European Convention of Human Rights, which we abide by in the UK, and as do EU and Ireland. So the balance that the legislators have to make in Ireland, but also because we're part of the same legislation in Europe, Scotland and England and Wales and Northern Ireland, is protecting certain groups from hate speech while maintaining the right of freedom of expression. And where that line lies is where all the anxiety is coming from. And I get that. And it has to be dealt with very, very carefully. Not having a definition of hate is in itself problematic. And I think there will be a definition of hate at some point, but it may not be made until another authority in Ireland decides what that is. In the UK, the definition of hate, which is then implemented by the police, is developed by the Crown Prosecution Service. And the way they define it is by stating hostility towards an identity, a protected identity. What that hostility looks like is usually decided in the court and by a jury of one's peers.
So the Crown Prosecution would have to say, okay, that meets the threshold.
Yes.
Right.
But but the threshold will then be followed up by a lot of guidance on what prosecutors should be looking for. So when it comes to social media content in particular, there are certain considerations they think. I've put a post on LinkedIn about this recently, actually, because I was talking about the legislation in Scotland. So first of all, it has to be either causing gross offence for it to go forward, not just offensive. But what gross offence is, again, is up for debate. If it's
that's not defined, Matt, is it? Is gross offence defined?
It's not. It's defined in court. So this stuff is usually then defined in court. But usually, gross offence means it has to be the average person on the street, as they define it, this is how it's usually defined, the average person on the street has to think that's grossly offensive, not merely offensive. So insulting someone is fine. Okay, disagreeing with someone is absolutely fine, but it may be grossly offensive to dead name a trans person. Now, we don't know whether or not, there's a recent bit of a court case has just occurred in the UK with J.K. Rowling and India Willoughby, where J.K. Rowling was dead naming India Willoughby on social media. It went to court, and the ruling came out that it was not hate speech, and that dead naming didn't count because the gender critical camp of this debate, which is opposing the trans rights camp, has a right to freedom of expression, and dead naming a trans person is their right of freedom of expression. Okay, this has just been decided in court. So what we'll find in Ireland and Scotland are similar cases coming before the courts, and the courts will decide on what's appropriate or not. And it's a kind of that seemingly democratic process where the people get to decide, i.e. in the form of juries, but also in the form of magistrates and judges, what is appropriate in relation to this legislation. So it takes time to tease out what this looks like. And there's faith in the process, I guess. I am slightly uneasy with the ruling that came out because I know a lot of trans people. I know how dead naming harms them and invalidates them. And as a gay man, I've come from an experience, a very particular kind of experience where I've felt similar kinds of pains in the past. And I know how debasing they are. But that was a decision made in the court of law, and that's what we currently have in the UK. But this just gives you an example of how this legislation goes from something that might seem quite woolly in the document itself to then how the courts have to decide based on the wisdom of the crowd, if you like, which comes in the form of a jury or the form of judges or magistrates who decide then what is and what isn't on that side or that side. But ultimately, there's a lot of guardrails on this kind of legislation, a lot of guardrails because of that European Convention on Human Rights for the Freedom of Expression. So ultimately, if there was a social media hate post, so to speak, and it was reported, the prosecutor would have to think, right, was this actually targeted at the victim? Was it intended to reach the victim, or was it just generally just said? If it wasn't targeted at the victim, then maybe it's less serious. Did the person who sent it immediately take it down? Did they show remorse over sending it? That's another factor they'll take into account, or whether or not it's in the public interest to proceed with a prosecution. What was the reach of the post? Did the post get seen by hundreds of thousands or just 5 or 6 people? That will have an effect on whether it's in the public interest to proceed. Was the person a minor? Does the person have a mental illness of some description? So many guardrails are put around this legislation and the eventual implementation of it that I'm actually quite comfortable with the current hate speech laws that we have in England and Wales. And you're going to get something similar in Ireland, and it's just been implemented in Scotland. So I think this moral panic that's being stirred up by certain parts of the media, certain individuals, ignores the finer detail of how this legislation manifests. And I have trust in the process because I know what these legislators, how careful they are when drafting this legislation. And then I have wisdom that juries that end up listening to these cases will make the right choice.
Do you think it in your conversations, for example, with the trans community, that there would be an argument to say, look, it is the price in a liberal democracy of living and existing in a liberal democracy? Sometimes our feelings, all of our feelings are hurt. That freedom of speech, I like freedom of speech because I like to know where people are, and if we like to know, I like to know where the people with extreme views are, what corner of the internet they exist, et cetera, that kind of way. And if you do anything to impinge, you will push them into the shadows and push them deeper and deeper. And I don't like that. Makes me very uncomfortable.
Yes, it's a really good observation, and you're completely right. When I've seen certain individuals removed off of Facebook and Twitter because of the things that they've been saying, they just pop up on underground platforms which are unregulated. And you're right, you get this displacement effect. They're displaced from the mainstream into the fringe, where they can probably have more power and damage, because they're just listening, they're just kind of in a an echo chamber of like-minded folks, so they become even more radicalized, possibly even worse. So we've seen this, I think, unfortunately, with J.K. Rowling. I think the way in which J.K. Rowling was talking about trans people 3 years ago is very different to how she's talking about them now, and it's like she's doubled down on the whole thing. From my personal kind of viewpoint in reading the content that she puts out there. And no, she's not been removed from the platform for what she's saying. And interestingly, the trans debate is one of those areas where platforms are more reluctant to remove content. Because
why do you think that is?
Because we're in the civilizing process of it. So we had the civil rights movement, we had the women's lib movement, the gay rights movement, which did include trans people at the time. Obviously, in fact, trans people were pioneering in that movement, but I don't think they achieved the same kind of advancements as lesbian, gay, and bisexual folk who were not trans. And it's happening now. And it's ugly. And it's largely, I think, people, the mass perception of it is that it's undecided. Which side you come down on, there's still no one's won yet. No one's won this debate yet. There will be a winner at some point, but no one's won this debate yet. It may take a bit longer than the others, because gender is something really fundamental to us. I know race and sexual orientation is fundamental, but gender is an interesting one because it really upsets people when you mess with it. It freaks us out when you start messing with gender. When you see a man dressed as a woman or a woman dressed as a man, or there's male or female traits in the opposite in the sex that they're not born with, it does something to us quite fundamental. And experiments of sort of psychological experiments prove that when you mess with perceptions of gender, it makes people uncomfortable. And a lot of homophobia is actually more about gender than it is about sexual orientation. It's more about men acting like women, or the perception that they will act like women, and vice versa, women will act like men. That's what upsets homophobes more than anything else. It's not necessarily the sexual orientation as such. It's how it's bound up with gender and gender stereotypes. And so we're in the throes of that on social media, and it's deeply ugly. And platforms are not regulating in the same way because they don't know what side is going to win. And I also think that those engaging in, maybe you might call it anti-trans rhetoric, are not the usual suspects as well. They're not the usual racist homophobes that we're used to targeting on social media. A lot of these folks seem like really reasonable people. And this also makes the whole debate more complicated and difficult to understand. And just to give you an example of this, we, in the Hate Lab, we build machine classifiers to identify hate speech. So machine classifiers work out how humans think about speech. And we do that by getting humans in a room, they look at a bunch of tweets, say, for example, and they tell us if they think it's hateful or not. And the tweets that get the most agreement, we then say 3 out of 4, 4 out of 4 people agree that that's hateful. That we feed to the machine and say, look, humans agree that that's hateful, so learn what that is. They agree that that's not hateful. So look at that and agree what, and then learn from those two examples what hate speech is. And the machine can then approximate a human by about 90% accuracy. It's very easy to do that with race, very easy to do it with misogyny, very easy to do it with homophobia. It's very hard to do that with trans identity right now, anti-trans rhetoric, because people cannot decide what is anti-trans and what is not. And if humans can't decide, i.e. there's very rarely do we get agreement. Mostly there's 2 people saying it's not and 2 people saying it is. We get a 50-50 split. And you can't give that to a machine because a machine can't make its mind up then. So ultimately our machine classifiers for anti-trans content are not very well performing because we can't get humans to agree. And this is a reflection on a micro level of our little technical problem we have in the lab. It reflects society at large. And we're in that process right now.
I had a look at a lot of J.K. Rowling's tweets, and you're absolutely right. 3 years ago, a lot of what she was talking about seemed perfectly mild and reasonable questioning of, say, but then she attracted an enormous amount of hate, and it was ferocious.
Yes.
And would you monitor hate from the side of perceived the victims, if you like, those groups who would be perceived as victims, but they're pushing out hate as well?
Yes. Yes, interesting. Even after Brexit, for example, we had people on sort of the more progressive side hating on the people who voted to go out. So, hate can come from both sides. We talk about far right all the time, but we also have the far left.
Hello, everyone. If you enjoyed that short clip, the full extended version should be right about down here, and the subscribe button should be over here. So don't forget to go ahead and click. Thank you.